So Chris, what I really want to know is what your family's experience has been from being biodynamic farmers.
So for me, the cool thing is I can tell you the real life experience of being a conventional farmer and then the transition to biodynamics. Because we've been living in this farmhouse here for about 35 years. And when we first moved out here, it was 1980, Halloween of 1980, we came out here and we farmed conventional because we didn't really know any better. And we just kind of went out there and all our neighbors farmed a certain way and we kind of saw what they were doing, we kind of copied them. I kind of call it the spray and pray method, but you know, if there was a problem in the vineyard, you talked to the Monsanto guy and he gave you a big bag of methyl ethyl bad stuff and you went out and nuked the vineyards. But see, prior to this, the property had been left vacant for 50 years, so it was a beautiful garden. It was in great shape because no one really had farmed it, so it was left to its own devices. It was very healthy. But then we got in there, we cleared the land, put up the fencing and started spraying and planting grapevines. And every year I watched that property slowly die and die and die. And then you fast forward 10 years and I remember walking through the vineyards and the grapes looked good, but there was no cover crop. It was dirt, and that dirt was either rock hard or it was pulverized talc. Every time it rained, there would be erosion issues. We had phylloxera, we had nematodes, outbreaks, and worst of all, our wine quality wasn't getting any better. And for me, the big moment was I remember being in the vineyards, and the only sound I heard was wind. Oh. No bugs, no birds, nothing. And I realized that, man, this was a sad piece of property that 10 years prior was a healthy garden. So we knew we needed to switch. And that was about 1994. And we started to bring in biodynamics that we learned from the Ciego vineyard up in Mendocino and Alan York, God rest his soul. We brought in our practices, and it took us about 6 years to transition the property. In the first 3 years, it was very tough. We almost gave up. But then we saw how some of the European properties did it, and that gave us the kind of energy to pursue it to its end. And then in 2000, we started to see the fruition. We started to see this piece of property come back to life. And now we fast forward a couple more decades to 2016, and you walk out in that vineyard, and it's every bit as healthy as it was when we first moved here in 1980. The only difference is that it's a working farm, where before it was left fallow. Now it's a beautiful working farm that makes incredible wine and olive oil and figs and vegetables. All sorts of wonderful things are grown on this property now because of biodynamics.
And don't forget the kiwis.
The kiwis, that's right, the fuzzy grapes. Yeah. So for me personally, I watched it happen. I didn't really know what was going on, but I watched it. So you will find no more of a true believer in biodynamics than myself.
There's nothing like one's personal experience, especially when you're living around it, because just very recently they were saying how the highest cancer rates in the state were in this region. And I very much attribute it to the chemicals used in the vineyards.
Well, it has to be. It has to be. It's the only thing that's changed. And for me, just to see a piece of property rebound and then kind of come back to life, it's amazing. And you walk out on this piece of property now, and it's breathtaking the amount of activity that's going on, natural activity, and you see it work.
I know it because as a tour guide, I visit hundreds and hundreds of wineries and thousands of vineyards, and it's very remarkable when I come here. The feeling on the land is distinctly different. When I go into land, which they've been using chemicals, and I feel it. Yeah. My body reacts.
You can feel it. I smell it. That's the first thing when you drive down into some of these production farms. You smell it. It's a very distinct, very unnatural chemical smell. But like you said too, you can also feel it, and it's probably more tactile and hearing and everything together. But you know when you're on a healthy piece of property because it surrounds you.
Well, what's interesting for me is that when you look at biodynamics, it's as if you're having a conversation with the land. You're treating it as a living
That's
organism.
A wonderful, I love how you say that, a conversation with land, because that is what you're having there. And with that, the land kind of, it speaks to you and it lets you know, because we actually, we had 65 acres of grapes back then when we were farming this property unbalanced. Now we have it down to 40. Those other acres, I referred to them, the entire piece of property is 85 acres. We have 40 acres under vine. Those 45 acres are now the supporting cast, if you will, that makes the 40 acres of vines, the lead actor, more believable. And so they bring back the life back into those acreage, whether it's riparian or pasture land, or gardens, insectaries, orchards, groves, all this stuff brings this property back to life.
Whose idea was it to start the educational component?
That would have to be my brother Mike. He was very instrumental. He always believed in biodynamics. Back in the 70s, he had a book that he carried from home to home to home. Wherever he went, he always had this book. And it spoke to him, literally. And that's what gave him the ideas to switch over to biodynamic farming. And when Alan York, who was very instrumental in helping us consult to become biodynamic, when he saw this property, he fell in love with it too, because when you look at this piece of property, it's not valley floor property. It doesn't run up against a bunch of other vineyards. It's kind of its own entity.
Microcosm.
Right, and we can farm this holistically very much in the sense that the entire piece of property is one entity.
When you first started in education, what was the first component you put into place?
I think it was the tour was the best bit, because we physically wanted to show people this whole piece of property. And I'm always surprised that more wineries don't have physical tours in their vineyards, because everyone sees tanks, stainless steel, a crusher. That's all the same. It's the piece of property that has the uniqueness. So we want to take people out there and show them, kick the dirt clods, if you will.
Right.
That was my favorite part.
Right.
Get them up on a hillside and you can show them. And once seeing is really believing. That whole thing, a picture is worth 1,000 words. In this case, it really is. But there's also not just the seeing. There's the smelling, the hearing, the whole experience that really makes a difference. So the tour was the most important part. And then we have this big insectary that is also kind of brings everything together, and people walk through what they think is a vineyard. It turns into this gorgeous flowering garden with every plant having a dual purpose, not only just to look good, but attracting some predatory insect or being a home to some other bird that goes out and eats a bug, whatever it is. It's really neat to see people walk through these gardens and understand that these are beneficial gardens. There's a reason why they're there. Right. I think that's neat. And then probably the other thing that I love is the animals, because they add, as Rudolf Steiner says, animals bring the personality to the farm. And you see people, I don't know if it harkens back to childhood or things like that, but people love to see the sheep and the chickens and the cows in the field. And it brings back this idea that we are a true farm. And I think, unfortunately, with vineyards is they're often not thought of as a farm. It's right. Thought as this chateau or some beautiful place where wine is magically made. But vineyards are working farms, very much so. You get your hands real dirty. It's very laborious work. And it's neat to kind of show people all the work that's done to go into a great bottle of wine. Because let's face it, a great bottle of wine is grown. Mm. It's not manufactured. It's produced in the sense that it's grown, and then a good winemaker shepherds it through its transition into wine. And one of my best sayings is the best impression that a winemaker can leave on his wines is his footprints in the vineyard. Oh. And that's the key part of it. You have to walk your vineyards. And that's the great tenet of biodynamics, is this idea of self-observation. And that's what most people don't think of. You need to be on your property. You need to experience your property. You need to intuit what's going on there, because biodynamics, in a way, you need to be proactive. You have to read the book of nature, if you will, because if you have a problem out in the North 40, you can't go nuke it, okay? You can't put some stuff in the nifty 50 and go out there and spray it. That's not what's gonna happen. You have to live with that. So you have to know where the wet spots in the vineyards are, where the dry spots, where the hole in the fence is, all that stuff, so that you can fix it ahead of time and be proactive in it, and that way not have a problem that it's gonna ruin your harvest down the line. That's why a lot of the people that work with us have been here since we've been here, because they can walk through the vineyards and they know every plant almost on a first name basis.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I noticed too when you're placing things like your owl houses and such, you want to make sure you go after the gophers, but not so fiercely that you interrupt the life cycle.
Right. Exactly. And it's neat how we made that mistake one time by putting too many owl boxes, and what happened? They fought each other. And then you had owls killing owls, which is something you don't want to have happen. So it's interesting. So you have to have just the right population of everything. And it's really, not to steal that line from that movie, but it's if you grow it, they will come. And it's really neat to see that happen. It doesn't happen often. It took us 6 years. And those were some tough 6 years because the land was damaged. So it has to kind of go through a purification, if you will.
Exactly, just like the human body, everything in life has
Absolutely,
its cycles.
like a detoxing, if you will.
You can't rush the cycle because it's nature and it has its own cycle.
Yeah.
I remember many times coming here and seeing turkeys up in the vineyards during the winter time and realizing how happy they look.
Yes, yeah,
Good sign.
and pooping right along. You know, that's the great thing about the sheep. In one step, they're eating, clearing the land. Their little cloven hooves are cleaning the vineyard floor, so there's nothing that's going to overwinter and throw out potential mildew spores that you'll have to fight in the spring. And they're dropping the golden turd out the back end,
Yes.
fertilizing. You know, much more gentle on the land than, let's say, a big old tractor or something like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. I know I've seen research recently saying that the nature of terroir has a lot to do with the microflora of the soil.
Right. Exactly. And you're right. That mycorrhizal growth. It's the plant internet system, if you will. And that the healthier that soil is, it's great. And like I said before, I watched this place have terrible soil. It was dead, talc, hard rock, or powder. And now you go out there and it's just so much fun to see this beautiful soil in all its glory. And when you dig down through the topsoil and the subsoil into that beautiful area called the regolith, then you really can see what makes Sonoma Mountain and what makes the wine so great here, because it's fractured bedrock. It's like a geological lasagna from basalt and red aggregates and white welded tufa with obsidian chunks in there. It's an amazing layered soils that the root systems now are healthy and going down into those different layers of soil and coaxing out those different nutrients and minerals, getting a wine that truly has a fingerprint of where it is. The wines truly taste where they're grown, the vineyard, what they're made of, Cabernet Sauvignon, when they're grown, 2016. You know, they have all those fingerprints of a place, you know, Sonoma Mountain, Cabernet, 2016. It's amazing to see. And the winemaker, Michael Benziger, for past vintages, and now Andrea Card for future vintages. It's amazing.
Yeah, I always look for wines that feel authentic,
Yeah.
which is it of the
That's
place?
what biodynamics is. And if I had to put a word to biodynamics, it's a management system for authenticity.
Oh,
That's kind of, you know, if you wanted to put it into, you know, a business school tactic, it's much, much more for that. But if I was going to be a producer and I was going to sell biodynamics to whether it was going to be a vintner or someone with orchards or whatever, or cosmetics, it's so all about authenticity. You're going to get flavors out of that piece of property that you never knew you had. And you're going to celebrate your uniqueness. It's going like the Mona Lisa has that crooked smile. That's what biodynamics does so well, is it takes that crooked smile and turning what would be a detriment into a benefit. It would give it that uniqueness, that authenticity.
in fact, I think that's one of the things that most amazes me about it is how it celebrates diversity, even to the plants themselves. We know that plants communicate.
Yeah.
Well, I think if you put them in a situation where there's other types of plants around, they're much happier.
Absolutely.
It's like being part of a big family. I mean,
Right.
you find like the elderly do much better when there's young children in the house.
Right, they kind of communicate in their own way, and there's so much we don't know.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing too, is to kind of stop that hubris that we think we have everything under control and that we understand everything, and to kind of take your hands off a little bit of the steering wheel of life and kind of letting it go a little bit and just seeing what happens.
Exactly.
And sometimes you'll be impressed with the results.
Wonderful.
Next, Ralph interviews Joe Papendick, the head gardener at Raymond Vineyards, about how he uses biodynamics daily.
So when you came to Raymond, how developed was the property? How developed was the theater of nature?
It was conceptual only. So from the tasting room door all the way out here, this entire space around me was just a field, a dirt, completely barren. There was no plants at all. So from here all the way out to Zinfandel Lane, they were going to replant the vineyard as well as the garden was in the concept stage. And so we were beginning to break ground on that. That was 4 years ago now that we broke ground on this spot.
That's a remarkable amount of progress.
Thank you.
If you look at it. Also, it's interesting, I remember you telling me that when they replanted the vineyards, they realigned them as well. Mm-hmm. They changed the direction of them. And it must have been quite a change from years of conventional farming to biodynamics.
yeah, well, bringing back the life. And so that was a big part of realigning with the orientation for the sun and for the wind and for the timing of the grape varieties that are being planted here for when they mature, as well as for the garden and just bringing in, introducing native plants, plants that provide a host for beneficial insects that can develop soil biology and bring back soil health and bring back life onto the property and the diversity that that already is here occurring in the valley, but giving it its home.
Right.
And so I can see the improvement in our plants through being organic and biodynamic, and the improvement in the health and the life, the health of the ecosystem that has resulted in transitioning to biodynamic and organic,
Yeah.
and also the resistance to disease and pests that has come through growing plants organically and biodynamically. But I can't say how it is affected by having a neighbor that's organic or biodynamic,
Right.
or having a neighbor who's growing conventionally.
Right.
So I guess it creates a patchwork throughout the valley where you don't have the same open corridors. So if you had, for example, neighbors who were all organic and biodynamic, then you could coordinate hedgerow plantings and other plantings throughout that would allow for a corridor below the soil or above the soil,
Right.
of wildlife.
How important is biodiversity in a garden?
It's essential. I mean, in a garden, if you're trying to grow even just one tomato plant for yourself, that needs to be supported by a myriad of different plants and animals and life. And so in order to have the best tomato plant, you need to have your supporting role and your characters that are there around you. So that either comes through cover crops that you planted before, what you planted before the tomato plant was planted, with what's around the tomato plant to bring in beneficial insects that can be your first line of defense against pests or even against disease as well, to help deter and create an environment that'll be healthy for that plant. And what was it? I recently saw a quote that I liked. It kind of goes to this. It's when the flower's dying, you don't go to the flower and say, why is the flower dying? You say, what happened? Why is it not caring? Am I not watering it? Did I not take care of the soil? What am I doing? So that's the same aspect of, what are you doing to support the plant, and then how will the plant perform in that experience? Yeah. And so the big part with biodiversity here is, well, with your natives and your hedgerow plantings, and bringing what is here, what nature has native, and that has a whole thousands of beneficial insects that can then support the other plants that you're growing for agriculture, and how that balance. When you just have one plant, you can have one pest come out and wipe the whole thing. Right. And it's dangerous. It's a fine line. And so then you use one chemical to spray on it, as opposed to having thousands of different plants and animals that can be there for your defense.
Yeah, the danger of monoculture.
Yes.
You know, it's always a big issue. Yeah. I think it's interesting that when Rudolf Steiner did his lectures, he basically said to the farmers, you got to realize, I'm not a farmer. You have to prove this stuff.
Yes.
When you're selecting the plants to put together, are there guidelines? Are there written guidelines, or is it passed down as a oral tradition?
The trickiest part with biodynamics. Is there's Rudolf Steiner, who gave his lectures. They weren't written documents or a written recipe. It was open to interpretation. And to be certified, we want to have a way that we can have a matrix to see what we're doing. Right. And so the certification agencies have come together and have created sort of that recipe of what to put in. What's the minimum that you can do? And then you go and you visit biodynamic farms, and everyone's, of course, always being honed to their site. What's successful in their location. And so while maybe the recipe for what was in Europe at that time may not be applicable to what we're doing here, we try to, and we bring in what we can. And conveniently, a lot of the plants that are in the biodynamic lectures are native to California as well. And they're occurring here, and they occur in Europe, they occur in the United States, and so they are applicable. But but finding how they work with our seasons. A big part right now is when do we time the bearing of the preparations and digging out of the preparations, and how does that go with like when California, when things are waking up right now and it's time to spray the preparation 500, may not be corresponding with what's happening in Europe because they're still under snow, or even on the East Coast, or even in other parts of the United States. So finding the fine tunings of when is it appropriate for our location, and how does the earth respond, and how can we respond with it. So a big part of that's just knowing your site, seeing how your site is changing every year, and how can you improve it so that it's always getting better and healthier.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's evolving and learning your site, learning what plants respond, and bring in the whether it's an energy that plant has, whether it's a nutritional quantity that plant has, whether it's the biodiversity of attracting all of the native plants, native insects benefits that are there. It's all of the above, and having all that. The biggest part to biodynamics I see is the connection. Everything has to be interconnected, and so you want to open up those connections between the plant world, the human world, and what's going on around us, and even up to the cosmos. And so allowing those connections to occur, and you have to be present on the site to find those.
And how do you feel you are along in your personal process 4 years later?
I've always looked at 7 years as being like a learning curve. And you always have to remember in agriculture, a season, you have kind of 1 year to do something. So if I'm going to go back to the tomato or to the grapevine, we're going to try one thing for a year, and then you got to do it one more time.
Right.
That's next year. And you can fine tune with some other crops and other things more and more and throughout the year, and have times to do kind of more experiments or get in touch with how things react with rain runoff or soil retention, or plant different cover crops and then be able to see how they're responding. But it's a slow process. And it's always one that you're learning. Every year you're learning, and also if you're making a mistake, it may take 3 or 4 years to figure out what's the source of what you've done that's created what's reaction. And sort of figuring out to fine tune things. Because sometimes you may have an idea, that's been the compost I've been applying, or my compost recipe is creating this reaction. And then, no, actually, so we were in 3 years of drought. Now we're in a year of rain. What's going to happen there? Was it a water issue, or was it a soil issue, or is it both? And how are all those things interlocked? So to watch a property evolve, it's always evolving. And it's always going to hopefully, the goal is to be in tune to it so it's always better. So you're always leaving it for the next year in a better condition. And so the minute you see a decline or something that's stressed or having it needs support, figuring out how you can bring that support into the property, into the system, and having the whole property be balanced in that way.
Right.
So it's constantly an evolution and constantly evolving. But seeing this property from bare soil, I can see the garden beds and their performance, and the yields are increasing, and the disease resistance is getting stronger. I saw that in 3 years.
Really?
So you can begin to see how things have evolved. And now I'm learning how to fine tune how much to irrigate, and reducing your irrigation because of the imperformance in the soil, as things also get established too, and move away from, especially with a lot of the plants that we had to plant brought in from nurseries, and not things that we started here ourselves, and what we started ourselves versus what can be here. The volunteers, the plants that have been sown through seeds that have been broadcasted in the wind, or seeds that have been harvested elsewhere and then dropped on site, and those ones, as they become established, the site begins to really develop its own personality, and then that begins to speak for itself too, of what works here, what is successful here.
What's been the dominant volunteer plant that's shown up here?
The one that I've allowed to remain, that I'm happy with, is the coyote bush. And so that's some over here. There's some also on behind the light green, the dark green plant. That's coyote bush. That's a California native, and it's one of our plants, a host to tens of thousands of insects. So very important for the bird community. The birds love coming into coyote bush because there's a lot of insects to eat in there, but also those insects are, there's some beneficial native California bees, parasitic wasps, different things like that come with that plant, that live with that plant, and then those are beneficial for attacking pests that are in your garden as well. So finding that balance. And those are ones that have all volunteered, and they need no irrigation. It's part of California. So they're here, and if I don't pull them out when I'm weeding, they'll thrive.
You're in a unique situation in that you came onto a property that was bare earth, and then you were given a mandate to create, with your team, create an educational vineyard.
It's an exciting challenge. It's one that it was one of the challenges that I appreciated with the position, to be able to have a bare slate and allow a garden to come out of the ground from there. And so definitely there's the educational component and the narrative and goals that the garden needs to be productive and producing and a demonstration for the success of biodynamics. And then going back kind of to the Steiner, to what's the recipe to put in here, this was allowing we had our goals for what we've seen in other successful gardens in California. And so it's bringing the inspiration from those gardens, how could we make it have its own personality at the same time relate to these other successful gardens and techniques that have been already practiced for 30 to 40 to 60 years in California.
I didn't realize that biodynamics had that long of a tradition here. I guess organics go back that far, though.
What's difficult with the word biodynamic is it's not always used. And so you have to look at the practices and who's farming and the technique that they're using. Because a lot of the original natural, holistic horticulturalists who arrived in California, and so the one that kind of inspired me and kind of I began to learn, I didn't learn directly from him, but there's Alan Chadwick, who came to the University of California in Santa Cruz in the early 60s when University of California had just started in Santa Cruz. And he was a student of Steiner. He studied directly under Steiner. And he came out, he was a gardener, a horticulturalist who went around the world doing other garden projects and then was brought into Santa Cruz to develop their garden program there. And he didn't use the word biodynamic, but he invoked all of the forces that were out there and really wanted to develop a garden to speak for itself, and was a brilliant horticulturalist, and was all about taking it in and learning about it in the experience. Hands-on, you dive in, but you bring in these plants and the health of the plant and the health of the site through the Steiner and through biodynamic philosophy that he'd been raised with.
Interesting.
We hope you found this insider's look entertaining. Come back and join us for another episode of Wine Country at Work.
You're quite the handsome bird. Yes, you are. Yes, you are.